1916, the Western Front. 1,000 kilometers of trenches stretch from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Men huddle in mud, and artillery fire never stops. This was the face of World War I, a war defined by trenches, by static front lines, and unimaginable slaughter for a few hundred meters of ground. Just over 20 years later, the world plunged into a second global conflict, one even more destructive. But this time, the war looked very different. Trenches still existed, of course, but the Second World War was not a static trench war. It was fast, mobile, and devastating in its reach. So why didn't the world's biggest war fall into the same muddy trap? There were 5 big reasons, and they changed warfare forever. To understand them, we need to see why the First World War became stuck in the mud in the first place. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, military strategy hadn't kept pace with technology. Generals planned grand offensives using 19th century tactics: mass infantry charges, frontal assaults, and cavalry breakthroughs. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British troops walked towards the German trenches, slow and in formation. A 19th century tactic used in a 20th century battlefield. They suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day of the battle.
A brilliant new tactical plan to ensure final victory in the field.
Would this brilliant plan involve us climbing out of our trenches and walking very slowly towards the enemy, sir?
How could you possibly know that, Blackadder? It's classified information.
The battlefield had become a fortress. Well-entrenched machine guns tore advancing soldiers to pieces. Artillery bombarded enemy lines from kilometers away. Barbed wire turned no man's land into a death trap, and poison gas seeped silently through the trenches. Defense had become stronger than offense. The result was a deadlock. On the Western Front, both sides dug trenches for protection, and then couldn't break each other's lines. Every offensive ended in slaughter, and the front barely moved for years. One of the clearest examples of this deadlock was the Battle of Verdun in 1916. For 10 months, French and German forces fought over a relatively small stretch of land. Villages were reduced to rubble, forests were erased, and the landscape turned into a cratered wasteland. The objective wasn't speed, it was attrition. The German plan aimed to bleed France white. Both sides poured men into the battlefield, launching repeated assaults against heavily fortified positions. Artillery dominated everything. Millions of shells fell on the battlefield. Entire units advanced, only to gain a few hundred meters, sometimes less. Then they were pushed back again. By the end of the battle, more than 700,000 casualties had been suffered, and yet the front line had barely moved. 700,000 men for a few kilometers of muddy ground. Let's compare that to the Second World War. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, their forces didn't advance slowly or dig in. They raced forward. Tanks punched through defenses. Aircraft bombed railways, airfields, and command posts. Infantry followed in trucks, not on foot. In weeks, Poland collapsed. The same pattern repeated in 1940, when France fell in just 6 weeks, despite having one of the most fortified borders in the world. But this time, the breakthrough was even more dramatic. German armored divisions concentrated at a weak point in the Allied line and smashed through with overwhelming speed. Once the line was broken, they didn't stop to dig in. They kept moving. Panzer divisions drove deep behind Allied positions, cutting supply lines and isolating entire armies. Units that expected a slow, methodical war suddenly found enemy tanks far behind their lines. Aircraft struck roads and railways, preventing reinforcements from arriving. Mechanized infantry followed the tanks, securing ground while the advance continued forward. Within days, Allied forces were cut off and pushed toward the coast near Dunkirk. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were trapped, and only a desperate evacuation saved them. Within weeks, France, one of Europe's strongest military powers, had fallen. This new kind of warfare had a name: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars were fought. Speed, coordination, and mobility replaced static front lines and slow offensives. The battlefield was no longer dominated by trenches, but by movement. So, what changed? Why was the Second World War so different? The first reason is tactical evolution. The interwar years were not just about rebuilding. They were a time of intense military reflection. Nations studied the failures of World War I. New doctrines emerged, and none of them involved getting stuck in the mud again. Germany led the way with combined arms warfare. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support were used together, moving as one unit to punch holes in the enemy line and keep advancing before defenses could reform. Another reason is mobility. In World War I, armies moved on foot or by horse. In World War II, they moved with trucks, half-tracks, and trains. Mechanized armies could cover hundreds of kilometers in days, too fast for trench systems to be effective. Technology had also changed. Radios gave commanders real-time communication with their forces. Aircraft could scout, strike, and supply. Paratroopers could drop behind enemy lines. Armies weren't limited to what they could see or march toward. They could now coordinate across vast areas with speed and precision. The terrain of World War II also played a role. It wasn't just fought in the narrow corridors of northern France and Belgium. Battles raged across deserts in North Africa, frozen steppes in Russia, islands in the Pacific, and mountains in Italy. In most of these places, long, continuous trench systems were either impractical or strategically irrelevant. And perhaps most importantly, the balance between offense and defense had shifted. In World War I, the defender had every advantage. A few machine gunners could hold off hundreds of attackers, and artillery would wipe out massed infantry before they even reached the wire. Trenches were necessary just to survive, but by the 1940s, armored vehicles, air support, and fast coordination meant that offensive forces could finally break through fortified lines. Defense was no longer dominant. Attackers had the tools to punch through and keep moving. That's not to say trenches were gone. Far from it. Soldiers still dug in to hold ground or prepare for attacks, especially during brutal battles like Stalingrad or the long siege of Leningrad. The Eastern Front could feel just as grim and static as World War I. But these were moments of trench warfare within a much more mobile and fluid conflict. World War II was defined by movement, by speed, by mobility. Instead of holding a line, armies tried to break it. The goal was not to sit and wait. It was to overwhelm, encircle, and destroy. And that's why World War II wasn't a war of trenches, but a war of momentum.